Welcome to our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold. You know, you and I are lucky to live in Montana. It's such a great place. And I've had a chance in my working career to live in other great places. I mean, from Alaska to the Appalachia Mountains of Virginia to New Mexico, and then places in Montana like Missoula and Yellowstone National Park and Billings, Montana. In all these great places where I've lived, there was always wonderful outdoor recreation opportunities and wild land to roam and get acquainted with, add depth to any person's life. But when I had a chance to finally come and live where I wanted to live the rest of my life, it was Montana. And you just can't beat this state. You know, we've got these absolutely gorgeous prairie lands that where the big sky is really the big sky, and that grades through some of these little mountain ranges into areas like the Bob Marshall and Beartooth wilderness areas. Really amazing places. You know, the preservation of these great lands did not come about by accident here in Montana. They came about because of the perseverance and hard work of Montanans. Some of them people's names you don't know, and some you do know. Two great senators who guided us through so much stuff. And a friend of mine and a group of I just heard the term gray greens, senior Montanans who've had so much to do with creating this outdoor wilderness heritage that we have, put together a book. It's called A Wildland Ethic. It was edited by Dale Burke and my friend Wayne Chamberlain. Excuse me. And I have with me today one of the authors who participated in writing this book. And I've wanted to get Teddy Rowe on this program for some time, and I got him here today. Teddy Rowe, welcome to our Montana.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure what do you think of this book after you added to it?
I think it's an extraordinary book because so many people contributed to it, and everybody has a different perspective, and yet everybody's going in the same direction. It's I think it's a wonderful book.
You had a chance to work with a lot of these people during your legislative career, did you not?
I did, but it's a great group of people, and they do a great job.
Hey, Teddy, I didn't give you much of an introduction about who you are, and I'm going to use your own words. Do you mind?
I don't
to introduce
mind.
yourself. And this is a little bit out of Teddy's writing in this Wildland Ethic book, and he calls it a kaleidoscope love affair. Here's what Teddy says. This will be a fractured tale of a love affair, one with high points, large gaps, and yet a continuity that sustains the narrative. I love Montana. I love it with a passion that eludes mere words. What started as a kindness to this underprivileged kid, an in-depth introduction to the state's marvelous outdoors, has returned time and time again in so many forms. Career decisions kept pointing away from the natural world, yet kept doubling back. He goes on to say, one cannot do justice to the depth and intensity of my Montana love affair without it painting a picture of contrast of before and after. And after decades of concentrating on the future, perhaps it is time to honor the past in print. The past is prologue, even for a love affair. So let's proceed. In a personal note, Teddy, you say this. I was born into a dry land farm family in southwestern Nebraska. No electricity. Parents with 8 and 9 years of education. 7 kids within 10 years. I was the oldest of 5 boys and a severe binge alcoholic father who made inevitable the loss of the farm to dust, drought, and drink. Wow.
Not the best beginning.
No, you don't look back on that as the good old days, do you, Teddy?
No, definitely not. The good old days began when I got to Montana.
Yeah. Well, tell me about, do you remember Dust Bowl days back in Nebraska? Those were hard times for everybody then.
I was on the disappearing edge of the main storms, but I contracted dust pneumonia when I was 9 months old.
Oh.
Was not expected to live, and my mother saved my life by draping my crib by soaking the blankets and draping the crib with it. Now, we knew what it was like to live on the edge, and eventually we lost the farm and hit the road still on the edge. My dad got a job as a hired hand on a farm near Broadview,
Here
which
in
is just
Montana.
outside of Billings, and that was my introduction to Montana. We ended up on the south side in Billings, very near the bars, and it was an exciting time. Let's put it that way.
Huh.
I made money putting beer bottles in a box, a cardboard box, and a rope to pull it by, and pulled it to Billings Brewery for income. And later I set pins in the bowling alley.
Oh, yeah.
And when the family reunited, it was 9 people by then, 7 kids and 2 parents in the same single room.
Good gracious me.
One point, I answered an ad for a gopher, some kid to run errands and take stuff to the post office from Connolly Saddlery.
Yes.
And a lot of our audience will recognize that name. Marvelous people. They took me under their wing, paid attention to me and my grades in school, and they turned my life around. Big thing in my life was that they had also just hired a young 20-something saddle maker from Colorado, and he was an outdoor type, and he needed company when he went fishing. And guess who was the company?
You got to go fishing.
Yes, and that was the beginning of yet another phase of life that was very formative. And so he was the perfect companion. He basically says, you bring the lunch and you bring your own tackle, which I did. Excuse me?
What's the chap's name that's taking you fishing?
Ranny.
Ranny.
Floria.
Ranny. And he's taking you to the Absaroka Beartooth.
Well, right. Of course, there was no wilderness then, so therefore there was no protection at that time other than agency protection, and they tried.
Little did you know at that time, Teddy Rose, the impact you were going to have on, or your involvement with preserving that area you were in as a kid.
Well,
with
this is what life is about.
Yeah.
The experience of actually fishing up in the Beartooth was completed in 2 years. I eventually was drafted into the Army, spent most of that time in the South. In my memory, went to the military, got the GI Bill for 2 years,
Oh boy.
and went on to the University of Montana, and which is a marvelous journalism school. I was a print journalist, and went into journalism after that. The University of Montana gave me intellectual stimulus that I would not have gotten anywhere else. When I got to Missoula, it was like the world was opening for me. Yeah. I went to Washington, D.C. on a congressional fellowship from the Ford Foundation and the American Political Science Association. When I went to work for Mike Mansfield, I really intended to be a journalist. I had done my best to convince the New York Times, you need me overseas, etc., and I think that I would have made it. And I told Mansfield no twice. He has this extraordinary, if people want to read something interesting, you'll have a hard time finding it by Mike Mansfield.
Really?
Because he was so self-effacing, never bragged about anything. Even when he wrote letters back to people in Montana, he never used the word I.
Really?
And when he died, he's buried under a little white marker in Arlington Cemetery. No fanfare, no nothing. He was very self-effacing. 16 years, he was the majority leader longer than anybody else in history.
Yeah.
But my main duty was on the Senate floor. I was on the Senate floor for the full 10 years.
When did you start dealing with public land issues?
I mean, we still had the Anaconda Company owned the newspapers. They didn't publish Montana news. They didn't lobby for, I suppose they lobbied against wilderness.
How did you,
Shortly after that.
How did you start working for Senator Lee Metcalf?
I never knew Lee Metcalf. He was an extraordinary person. He had been a justice of the Montana Supreme Court.
Yeah.
He had been a member of Congress. He had all the ingredients to be a go-getter senator. He was frustrated because he was locked into committees where basically Southerners, through seniority, always sat above him. And he could not have a leadership position because Mike Mansfield was a leader, and therefore you couldn't have two from the same state.
He was kind of stuck, wasn't
But Mansfield really used him a lot, especially during the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson's avalanche of bills, from voting rights to anti-discrimination, etc. And Mike put him in the chair for most of those. He was the presiding officer, certainly for the really big stuff, because Lee's name is on a fair amount of legislation because he signed the civil rights bill before it went to the president for signature.
Looks like our two senators did get along quite well.
Oh, they were extremely close, and it was terrific. But I had a chance to talk to Lee from time to time when he would come over to take the chair, and but I didn't claim to know him, and it was never things in depth. But I now leave Mansfield, I go back to school. I need to have an income to feed my family.
You're a married man now.
Yeah, and I had my eye on another job, and it dealt with foreign policy, but it wouldn't open and it wouldn't open, so I needed a job. I went out to Northern Virginia and went to a construction site and said, "Hire me. I'm a concrete worker." And for 3 months, that's what I did. I scooped concrete and worked with it, etc. Waiting for this other job to open. It never did, but I get a call from Lee Metcalf.
Okay.
And he says, "I need a new staff director, not a staff director, but a new legislative director." It was a most interesting interview. I went to him and he says, "Now remember, you work for me." And I thought, who else would I be working for? And remember also, I work for you. And if you ever need me to pick up the phone and talk to the secretary or an assistant secretary or whatever to move this, and he was true to his word. So I now am in charge of areas. I know the ins and outs of moving legislation pretty well, but I didn't know the ins and outs of Montana wilderness to that degree. Then I had to to look to the Bill Cunninghams and others who, so I was on the phone a lot. I would come to work at 6 o'clock in the morning to have time to be creative, etc., but I didn't have time to come to Montana.
Yeah.
So I learned on the fly, but with the best help that one could possibly get, the Montana Wilderness Association.
Let's see, Teddy, right at this point, the Wilderness Act had been passed, had it not?
It had passed, and here I was in my first, at least in the first 2 years of working on the Senate floor with responsibilities there. Here came the Wilderness Act. So I was privileged to listen to Hubert Humphrey and Lee Metcalf and other people waxing eloquently on the bill, and I recognized how important it was and how important it was to Montana. But once again, I was like Forrest Gump. He seemed to be everywhere something important was happening, and here was another example.
Now, the Absaroka Beartooth area was not part of that original Wilderness Act, was it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
The terms of the Wilderness Act were that those areas that had been protected by the agency, by the Forest Service, say, would automatically be given permanent protection. Wilderness protection means Congress has to approve and the president has to sign the paper. Well, so the first wave of wilderness really was bringing in what the Forest Service had already said was their highest priority. The Montana Wilderness Association and Montana devotees of wilderness really hadn't even promoted the Absaroka Beartooth. And that came about because Montana Wilderness Association and proponents were of two minds. Do we go for less acreage or do we go for the works and make it more difficult to even get the biggie? And
so there was concern that if you went too big, you couldn't get anything. Was that?
That's it.
That was it.
The split within the Montana wilderness community was fairly heated, but the unified joining the Beartooths closest to Billings and the Absarokas farther west, north of Yellowstone Park, it won out. Lee put the bill in. We had a hearing in Billings. I became fairly knowledgeable about the goal and the difficulties.
You were talking to Bill Cunningham and
that's right, and
Bob Anderson and
Bob Anderson and Bill Cunningham.
A lot of the people who contributed
and to Harrison Fagg of Billings
here in Billings
was very instrumental in that. And that's where it sat. Lee's health was deteriorating. He had heart problems, but in the following February, he died of a heart attack in Helena, was quickly cremated, buried with private ceremony, etc. And as far as we knew, that was the end of his accomplishments on behalf of Montana. And this chairman of the Interior Committee, which would have moved the bill, saved our life and saved the area, because he said, "What can we do to memorialize Lee?"
That was Scoop Jackson.
Yeah, Scoop Jackson of the state of Washington, and he checked around with everybody, including Donna Metcalf, etc. To me, there was no possibility of anything big enough to really fit a memorial for Lee Metcalf.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, and that was it.
In other words, did you suggest that we
Well, I was among those.
that we pass the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness into a wilderness, make it
Yes.
permanent protection.
Yes, to get permanent protection,
Yeah.
because he was chairman of the full committee. When the chairman says something, you at least pay attention.
Yeah.
And in the case of Lee, was well liked by Republicans and Democrats alike. When it came time to vote on a particular issue, they had their differences, but he was gregarious. He was well liked, and
Well, Senator Melcher was senator then too. How did I know that he was not a big supporter of wilderness?
no, he was a closet opponent of wilderness. And I'll tell you a story that nobody knows. John Melcher really came to the Congress with the help of Mansfield and Metcalf. He was a Democrat. He was from eastern Montana. Not many Democrats were from eastern Montana, etc. But he got on the House Interior Committee, and he ended up as chairman of the subcommittee that handled wilderness. So
Oh, my.
Mike and Lee would put in pro-wilderness bills, and they would go to the House, and somehow they would disappear. But whenever John Melcher was in Montana, and the press, which had no presence in Washington, they had nobody back there, they would say, what is this about you and Lee having problems over this particular bill or whatever? Nothing to it. We're the best of friends. And boy, it would set Lee off. It really would. He would
This is
stomp.
not the case.
He would just stomp into the. Well, I spent most of my time on what we called S393, which was the Montana Wilderness Study Act. My first day on the job, we had people from Montana coming say, we have a list here, and this is, we desperately need protection for these areas. I talked to Lee about it, and he said, oh my God, he said, that's too long, cut it in half. So we reprioritized, and the Wilderness Study Act is still in effect today, because in that we put, the wilderness people put a proviso that until or unless Congress decides otherwise, it will be maintained as wilderness.
Yeah.
So the battle that every time we have a legislative session, people are trying to get rid of it, and they cannot do it.
Yeah.
That bill passed the Senate with that proviso, and it went to the House side, and John Melcher's staff failed to catch that one line, and that one line, in effect, said
Huge.
he waved it on through.
He's huge.
And it made all the difference in the world. So the 393 lands are down from 10 to I think about 7, and part of the Lee Metcalf Wilderness today is a bastardization of one of those areas, but John Melcher was the one that
I'll be darned.
promoted it.
So Senator Lee Metcalf dies. You and others are proposing the memorial would be establishing the Absaroka Beartooth as wilderness. John Melcher is sitting in a key role. How did it get passed?
Well, as the chairman of the subcommittee on wilderness for the House, he basically stopped everything that he recognized and saw, but he did not stop this one. And he was fit to be tied, and of course Metcalf was pleased that he had another wilderness possibility. He had no problem moving the bill. Melcher came, and Melcher didn't oppose the bill. Oh no, he would not oppose it. But he wondered about what would we ever do if we had a fire in the Beartooths, and then all that debris would slough off down into the river, and the river which supports agriculture all over eastern Montana. But he was not opposing the bill, you understand.
Okay.
Okay. So we're talking about this magnificent big area. The last item in designation of formal wilderness before it gets the presidential signature is the map. And the map was drawn in my family room, in our home in Alexandria, Virginia. And Bill Cunningham and Bob Anderson, Bill is still a stalwart in the industry,
Yes,
or in the movement.
Yes, he
and
is.
Bob Anderson died tragically on safari in an accident in Africa. But they came to the house, and we put up sawhorses and big topo maps, etc. Those two people were not the only ones who could have done it, but they did a superb job because they both really knew the area.
And particularly Bob Anderson, who had been over every piece of it.
Bob really paid his dues, and it's a great monument to him, and a monument obviously to Lee. I just think of it as a great heart was stopped, but a great monument followed.
Yeah. Well, it was quite a piece of work, and it kind of came back to that love affair that you talked about in the book, didn't it, Teddy? I mean, you had a chance to kind of solidify where you first got your outdoor experiences.
Well, it did. I really have lived the life of Forrest Gump in green. I guess I'd put it that way.
You did. It's amazing how these life's twists come about. Teddy, we are out of time. I'd like to read one more thing here, if I might. This is out of what you wrote, Teddy. Of course, the muse of the mountains was surely there, as was the ghost of Ranny, who passed away shortly after my retirement to Montana. And finally, that of Montana's patron saint of wilderness, my elder, my leader, my friend, Lee Metcalf. The love affair began decades ago, is now fully requited. There will be no dalliance with another temptress. I continue to thrill every day as I see the shining peaks of the Beartooth from my home. Teddy Rowe, thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome, and I apologize for the scattered
Well, you've had
response.
a scattered life, Teddy.
That's true.